Hello, and welcome back to Coffee Wednesday, and I know I look ridiculous right now. That's because I didn't even have time to get changed. I literally have to turn on the camera, record this video, and basically have to sleep and make it to my 9 a.m. class tomorrow. And it's already 1 a.m., so not off to a good start. On today's video, I simply want to talk about this idea of maturity, age, life experience, and of course the act of reading for pleasure, for knowledge, and for your own sort of literary development. So here's a really interesting that I've noticed recently, which I want to share with you guys a little bit, because right now I am finishing up my third year of my literature degree, or third year of my double major French and literature degree. And of course, with a degree comes a lot of class readings, comes a lot of books that I basically have to reread from a few years ago. And one of these books that I basically have to reread was Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. And this book right here, when I first read it when I was 14, I was a bit of an emo, depressed person, and I dressed in black like Hamlet. And I just remembered myself reading this book in a little wooden cabin, and basically I've committed myself to literature from that day onward. One book led to another, and one story led to another, and basically now it's my full-time obsession, basically. But here's something that I've also noticed from my own reading experiences, which is that, so right now I'm at the ripe old age, or ripe young age of 21, which is, what, like if I do the maths correctly. That is 7 years since I first read Frankenstein, and probably read this book, multiple times throughout the years. But this time, when I'm reading Frankenstein again as a 21-year-old compared to a 14-year-old reading Frankenstein, the experience was completely different. The experience was so transformative that it's sort of like, when I look back at myself when I was 14 reading Frankenstein, I just basically thought to myself, you haven't read anything from this book. So many of the insights in the book you've missed, and so many of these amazing, fantastic commentaries on human nature and death, or this obsession with science, illustrated in this book, or the dangers of passions. I've basically missed all of those details when I was reading it when I was 14. And there's so many books that I've read when I was 14 or 15 or 16 when I was quite young that I'm just kind of like to myself, if I reread the same books again at my age right now, which is still quite young, I'm going to basically end up with a completely different experience. And the same case applies especially not just to literature, and also it applies to philosophy, definitely. So many of the treatises that I've read, for example, I first read, I think, Foucault's Madness and Civilization when I was 18. And now when I'm coming back to this entire Foucault collection of works, I'm currently reading a second volume of The History of Sexuality as a part of my course. The level of understanding definitely deepened over time. The level of understanding definitely reached like a whole new level. And that's based on life experiences. That's based on, should I say, having the right kind of mindset to tackle these books. And that's also based on maturity. The key idea of this video, if you want to take one thing away from this Coffee Wednesday episode, is that what you read not only just depends on how you read it, or it not just only depends on like, okay, I can read this now as a young kid, I'm 14 and I want to read Jean-Paul Sartre's, for example, Being and Nothingness, and I want to understand it completely. Age is a major constraint on your reading experience. Hate to break it to you. There are basically no child prodigies of literature, no child prodigies of philosophers. The finest letters that you're ever going to read in your life, you will probably read them later on in your life. Because right now, if you pick up the same book by the same authors, the level of understanding is so surface level. Even now as a 21-year-old, I feel like I can't really reach into those deep levels of insights when I read a philosophy book. I can't really reach into those really profound, should I say, ideas about the universe, because I'm not equipped with those life experiences and the kind of maturity to handle those ideas, or the kind of ways of reading that I need to acquire from higher education, or from further studies, from post-grad studies. I'm not saying that academia is the only way to really gain these experiences in the first place, but right now, the booktube community, or the entire philosophy community, or the university community as a whole, we are, as a culture, we're basically obsessed with this idea of the child prodigy, or the prodigy who could read, In Search of Lost Time when he was 12, or when they were 12. And that puts a lot of stress on us to read the kind of books that are basically not meant for us yet. Of course, you can read them when you're young, but then expect yourself not to have like a full-on understanding of the text. When people ask you about this text, the level of insights that you're going to reach as a 21-year-old, cannot even come, remotely close to a professor who's in their 40s, for example. And to expect yourself to reach the same level of understanding as an older person when you're reading these pieces of literature, and to sort of wanting to speed run this process of a literary education or a very philosophical and a very humanitarian education, that's simply psychotic. And this video is an invitation for you to really think about that idea of age and reading. And proper reading requires the life experience and age. And proper reading requires you to actually live life. Otherwise, what's going to happen is that you're going to live in a fantasy your whole life. Your whole, adult life, you're going to live in a fantasy. In a Gothic literature tradition, there's this idea of, feminine Gothic literature. They basically had this idea that reading too much fiction is actually bad for you, because you tend to have all these fantastical ideas about how life should work in fiction, or how to romanticize life, or how life should turn out. That you basically, when you face reality again, you're going to see all these imperfections and all these things that are messy, that are not exactly as beautifully presented as a piece of literature. And over time, you tend to land in the danger of living like a very Picard-esque lifestyle, where you're like living in a fiction, where you're like kind of like not living in real life. So you refuse to learn all the lessons life has to offer you, before you dive into literature again. Right now, after being on YouTube for a few years, after reading some number of books, I feel like the perfect synthesis is a combination of life and reading. And reading should supplement your life, but it shouldn't become your life. And this is why I particularly have a problem with this booktube culture of reading over 100 books a year. Because, what's the point of reading all of these books if you can't reach that level of understanding just yet? It's much more beneficial for you to put a book off and come back to it in a few years, once you've matured enough, once you've grown into the person who can appreciate these pieces of literature, and then you read it again. And that's when it's actually going to be worth your time, instead of scrambling right now, to try to read everything while it's kind of like defining yourself as a reader, and while it's not actually doing the reading. It's much better, in my opinion, for me at least, to sort of go through life experiences first, and then when you read this piece of fiction, and then when you read this biography, or when you read this philosophical text, the level of insight is going to be much richer, and it's going to be immediately applicable to you. And that's the right age to read that book. So you really have to check in with your intuition from time to time to think about, is this the right time to read this book? Am I too young to read this book? Or am I simply too mature to read this book? And that's basically a safeguard for you to step away from that entire, should I say, the pretension that comes with literature. Young men with their Nietzsches below their arms, with their Homer's Odyssey below their arms. They think they know absolutely everything about the book. But in reality, without age or maturity, that's a very surface level of understanding. That's why my video essays, right now in their current form, my sort of like take on literature, it's such a shallow analysis. I'm only scratching the surface of this entire journey of reading and making sense of the world, that if you watch videos from like people like Better Than Food or Leaf by Leaf, or some of these people who are like a little bit older, in their 30s into their 40s, their level of analysis will be much deeper than mine. And I'm here simply to document my journey, and of course with time and effort and persistence, I will eventually reach those deeper levels of understanding. But right now, I'm at a stage in my life where books are supplements to my life. Books are basically informing my understanding of life. And I love reading as an act. And I want to make sure every book I read, they're going to be enjoyable. They're going to be, they're going to make sense to me. They're going to make sense to my staging life. They're going to make sense to my experiences, instead of subscribing to like this neurotic need to read a lot whilst not understanding anything. And remember this, a foolish person can be a very well-read person, but those ideas, they remain ideas. They don't contribute to anything productive. They're just merely intellectual masturbation floating in the air. They're just merely quotes from these elegant pieces of literature, but they don't actually mean anything. Only with life experience and these books that you potentially want to read, when you combine those two together, and when you add maturity and age on top of that, that's basically where you get the perfect synthesis of getting a really rich and satisfying literary education. And there's no hurry. You don't have to read 100 books a year or even 50 books a year, but I just want to make sure that you will read the kind of books that you enjoy at your current stage of life. You want every book that you've ever read to be enjoyable, to be kind of like worth your time. You want all the effort towards reading to count towards something, to count towards understanding your understanding of the world. And there's really no point struggling with things that are simply not right for your age just yet, simply not right for your stage of maturity just yet. Come back to it 10 years later, come back to it 5 years later. I know this is, this is going against the grain of being well read, but sometimes you just need those years to think about things and come back to those books. And there's no hurry. This lifelong pursuit of literature, of understanding, of philosophy, and of history, this is basically a marathon. This is not a sprint, and you don't want to burn yourself out on a marathon just yet. And that concludes this week's episode of Coffee Wednesday, and I will see you in the next one, and happy reading.